The actual range here is pretty straightforward. Essentially, we're choosing when we want to simulate and when we want to stop simulating. Now this is important just to kind of keep in mind, because let's say we want to start our shot out with the flames already present. Okay, this means that we'd want to simulate earlier. So in other words, I might want to simulate with a value of -30, and that way when I begin to simulate, it will begin simulating from -30 to 100. Okay, and that means that essentially within that range we get a pre-roll, and it means that it will begin simulating back here. I may as well demonstrate, but basically -30 means that it will begin simulating here, okay, and then at frame 0 it'll already be present. Now for this to work, we also need to have the playback ranges working too. I will cover them a bit more in depth in a moment, but I've just put in -30 and I've synchronized these to be the same. And actually one last thing I'm going to do here, because I animated this just before, so I'm just going to turn it off so it doesn't move, and I might just adjust its radius a little bit too, just make it a bit bigger. But when we look at this, we'll have the fire burning, and it's already burning previously at frame -30. Now I'm not simulating all of this, it just means that if I were to look at frame 0, suddenly at frame 0 there's already fire on burning. So it's good because it means that I already have a simulation working before we even begin our shot. So this is something you would do a lot when you're establishing a shot. Obviously one of the biggest things that you see when people kind of overlook this is the fact that they'll have simulations begin right away, and you kind of see a lot of the general stuff already happening. Usually I try and pre-roll my stuff and have it already established, and it's just important to kind of have that in your shot, is to pre-roll everything so that way it's already burned and kind of gotten used to the temperature and everything in the shot. So that's just important to kind of keep in mind. Now in addition to this, it also means that I can initially set up my sim to start, let's say, at a later frame if I needed to start at a later time. If I have particles being spawned at frame 50, there's no need for me to simulate from frame 0. All that's going to do is slow everything down, and it also means that your container is going to be referencing and looking and reading information at those frames that aren't necessarily there or aren't necessarily necessary. So keep that in mind, that you might want to adjust this to be very specific to when you're simulating. It's very important to kind of keep everything intact, and that way you're able to get really efficient sims this way. The other thing is that a lot of people will run sims, or they'll create their shot, and their shot might be, let's say, 180 frames long. And one of the most common mistakes is that by default this starts at frame 0 to 100. So you run your sim, let's make the simulate a bit quicker, but you run your sim and then you wonder why at frame 100 it drops out. And it's not something that is complicated or is really going to trick you in terms of, you're never going to really be confused as to why your sim's stopping. However, it is something that is very overlooked constantly. So in other words, you might set up your shot, you set off the sim, and then you walk away and you come back a few hours later and you realize, damn, I've only simulated frame 100. I should have changed this value. So it isn't like some tricky, mysterious value, but it is something to always keep in mind, is does your frame length here match what your actual shot is? So it's always good when you're setting it up. I mean, I usually have a very general process of how I work. The same way if I were to jump into particle flow without thinking, and you'll see it whenever you see me load up particle flow, I always go in, I set that to 100, and I set this to an infinite amount. It's better to do this now than wonder why my particles are acting a little bit differently, because they're only showing 50% of the viewport, or more importantly, it's hit an upper limit and it stopped calculating the additional particles. So I do that because I'd rather not have to think about it later on. Same deal if I'm creating a drag. One of the most default things it does, it only goes up to 100. I always set that to a maximum value, and usually, negative 100 for that too. That way, right now my particles mightn't be using these, but later I might need to make an adjustment, pre-roll my particles, and suddenly I notice that my particles pre-rolling are going a lot faster than the particles at frame 0. That's because it didn't have drag applied. So personally, I think this should be something that you turn on if you want to control the timing. Otherwise, you have it as an infinite value that's constantly on. But those are things that I always do. Same thing when I load up Fume Effects for the first time. I add in my emitter. I go in the General tab. I set up the dimensions as well as my spacing, my output of where it's going, and I also make sure that the frame length and everything here is synchronized to what I want. In this case, it might be 180, 180, and maybe like negative 20 pre-roll, if that was the case, and I would make sure that these are synchronized too. So that's important to keep in mind. It's just the start and end frames is where you're doing your simulating. So don't worry about playback. All you need to look at this stage is just where you're simulating, like what frames are physically being simulated.